Hi everybody, and welcome to the carbon cycle and climate change. In this first video, we're going to be looking at carbon cycle only. Sort of combine the two units together because they are kind of very much interlinked. So without too much further ado, let's get on with what we're going to be talking about. So this is a very simplified version of the carbon cycle. What's really important at this point to remember is that the carbon cycle, we're not just talking about the carbon dioxide that's around us. Okay, a lot of the carbon that we consider being in the carbon cycle is to do with carbon dioxide, but it's not the be-all and end-all of it. Okay, so remember, within the carbon cycle, we've got to consider the following: carbon dioxide. We've got carbon that is in organic material, so in fats, in proteins, in carbohydrates. We're going to have carbon that's dissolved in the oceans. We're going to have carbon that is found in another very important gas called methane. Okay, so if you just take a look around this simplified version of the carbon cycle that you see in front of you now, you should be able to kind of place where these different types of carbon are found and which types of organism. And if you can't do it now, then hopefully you should be able to do it by the end of this particular unit. Okay, one of the major tasks of this unit is that you're going to actually have to make and design a model carbon cycle and explain all the different stages of it. So it's important as you go through this video now that you are recording some really key information. Anyway, without much further ado, let's try and focus on each area a little bit more. So the first one we want to focus on is what's happening in carbon fixation. Okay, so carbon fixation is the process by which plants take in carbon dioxide, and you can see that happening here. All right, so what we're talking about, of course, is photosynthesis. All right, CO2 is being absorbed by autotrophs. So autotrophs, remember, are things that make their own sugar or make their own food. So in plants' case, they make glucose during photosynthesis. This makes them autotrophic organisms. Okay, so they're absorbing that CO2 from the atmosphere and converting it into carbohydrates, lipids, and all the other organic compounds that they need it for. So generally the effect this has on the carbon cycle is it's reducing the amount of atmospheric carbon quite strongly, especially in areas that are heavily forested and where there is a lot of rainforest or boreal rainforest, different types of rainforest. It's going to reduce the concentration of carbon in those areas. Now, the average or the mean CO2 concentration for our atmosphere is about 0.039%. Okay, so it's pretty low. But again, like I said, higher in other places where there's rainforests. What else are we looking at? We're going to need to talk about the carbon that gets into solution. So you can imagine in aquatic habitats, it isn't just animals that live in these areas, there's plants as well. So they still need to get their source of carbon dioxide. So they can take that from the water because the water dissolves CO2. So you can imagine that as CO2 is entering from the atmosphere, as it runs over the surface along with the wind, okay, it's getting mixed in with this sort of turbulence layer, okay, and it helps the water mix into that water, and then it will go deeper into it as it moves through it. Now, generally what CO2 tends to do, it can do two things. It can combine with water, it can actually react with it to form something called carbonic acid. Okay, now carbonic acid has the formula H2CO3, and basically what happens very often in water, it dissociates. So that means it splits into its relative ions, which are hydrogen ions, or H+, and HCO3 ions, okay, which have a negative charge. Okay, and basically because you're releasing H ions into it, it has the effect of decreasing the pH of water. So this explains how carbon dioxide reduces or lowers the pH of water. Now, both dissolved carbon dioxide and hydrogen carbon ions are absorbed by plants and other autotrophs that live in water, and they use them again for photosynthesis, just like plants that live on land use gaseous photosynthesis from the land, from the atmosphere. Okay. Okay. So we know that carbon dioxide and our autotrophs is absorbed into plants. So on land, what tends to happen is that autotrophs, like plants, use the carbon dioxide to produce sugars during photosynthesis. And that has a tendency to reduce the concentration of carbon dioxide around and inside the autotrophs themselves. And so there's always a low concentration of CO2 within the plants, okay? And if there's a higher concentration in the atmosphere than there is within the plants, then of course you've got a concentration gradient, which means more CO2 enters by diffusion. And that diffusion gradient, or that concentration gradient that is set up, is very, very essential if plants are to utilize the carbon in the atmosphere. How that usually happens in plants, that diffusion is usually happening through the underside of the leaves. So here in this image here, you can see these cells here. This is a guard cell, this is a guard cell. There are two cells, okay? And in the center there is a pore, and this is called the stomatal pore. So these cells basically control the entry of CO2. When they're closed, no CO2 enters. When it's open, CO2 can get in. So you can imagine during parts of the day when the plant is photosynthesizing heavily, especially during the morning. Of course, remember, it's not just CO2 that enters through here, but water as well. So during the morning where it's cool and where there's not much water being evaporated out of the leaf, okay, this is going to be quite nice and open, allowing lots of CO2 to enter. Okay, during the afternoons or the hottest parts of the day, if it's a very hot country, these might close up. And they'll just have to make do. The plant will just have to make do with the CO2 that's stored inside of it. The last thing we need to look at, of course, is not just how CO2 is taken up by organisms. Okay, and which we remember the organisms that take up, we call these areas sinks, but we also have sources, so places which produce carbon dioxide. Now, what you can see here is a lion chasing looks like a gazelle. All right, and obviously during this process, there's going to be a lot of cellular respiration happening in the muscles of this lion and the gazelle. So these are going to be using the oxygen from the atmosphere, breaking down the glucose, using that oxygen and releasing CO2. And of course, then they're exhaling that CO2, which increases the CO2 within the atmosphere. Now remember, it's only during aerobic respiration that CO2 is being produced. Okay, anaerobic respiration in animals tends to produce lactic acid only. It doesn't produce aerobic respiration. It doesn't produce CO2. So during aerobic respiration, there will be a little bit of aerobic respiration going on in these guys. They're going to be producing CO2. But is it just animal cells? No, it's not. Okay, we've got non-photosynthetic cells in producers. So, for example, in plants like root hair cells are going to be producing and releasing carbon dioxide. We've also got things. Remember, all cells respire. Okay, even all plant cells respire, which means all cells produce CO2. However, some cells in the leaf are going to be using that CO2 again for photosynthesis. So even though they're producing it, they're going to be using it. So they may not get to release it. But cells that do not produce CO2, like root hair cells, cells that do not use CO2, like root hair cells, will be producing it and releasing it through respiration. We also have things like fungi. And these types of microorganisms, we call them saprotrophs. And what they basically do is they decompose dead things. So let's say the lion and the gazelle gets killed by the lion. There'll be parts of the gazelle which don't get eaten. These will lie in the soil, and very, very quickly these fungi will start to break down that nutrient-rich organic matter. Okay, and in that process, those fungi are going to be respiring heavily, and they're going to be producing a lot of CO2, which is released into the atmosphere. Okay, moving on. So very, very important to remember that we've talked about CO2 a lot as being the gas which is exchanged in living organisms. It's not just CO2. There is another gas called methane. Methane is produced from organic matter in anaerobic conditions. Okay, so by a special type of bacteria. Now, basically, how this was discovered was by Alessandro Volta, the man who came up with the idea of voltage in circuits in 1776. And what he did is he collected bubbles of gas that were bubbling out of a horrible, stinky kind of mud in a reed bed in Italy. And what he found out was that gas was inflammable. So when he he collected the gas and tried to set it on fire, he realized it was very, very highly flammable. And what he discovered was methane. And methane is produced widely in what we call anaerobic conditions, so conditions where there is no oxygen available. And it's often a waste product of a type of anaerobic respiration. So when bacteria, or a special type of bacteria called archaeans, when these guys respire, they do it without oxygen, and a byproduct of that is they produce methane. Okay, methane has the formula CH4. Okay, 1 carbon, 4 hydrogens. And basically, there are 3 different types of bacteria which do this. We've got a special initial type of bacteria that convert organic matter. So organic, remember, means carbon-containing matter. It converts that carbon-containing matter into a mixture of organic acids, alcohols, hydrogens, and CO2. You've then got a second type of bacteria that use the organic acids and alcohol to produce something called acetate and more carbon dioxide and hydrogen. The third type of bacteria are our archaeans, which we had talked about before. And these are the ones that are methanogenic. These are the ones that are going to be producing methane from the acetate produced in the last kind of series of reactions that happened. So it's three different types of bacteria. Now, if you are a course student, an SL student, you do not need to remember the 3 types of bacteria. You just need to remember where they're found, how it kind of works. If you're an HL student, then you want to really read up on those equations and look at the 3 different types of bacteria in a bit more detail. Basically, where you find these archaeans, these methanogenic bacteria that are producing methane, are in areas where there isn't much oxygen. So oxygen tends to live, oxygen in the ground and the soil tends to live in little air spaces. So areas where you get a lot of water, so swamps, muddy areas that tend to fill up with water, don't have much oxygen in them. So these are typical anaerobic conditions. Mangrove forests also fall into this area. These are also anaerobic conditions. Okay, these are the places where these organisms typically will kind of act. The guts of termites and of ruminant animals such as cattle and sheep, okay, will also find a lot of these types of bacteria. And so cattle and sheep produce a lot of methane, okay? When they fart, they produce a lot of methane. Now, methane we're going to come back to when we look at the carbon cycle, when we look at global warming, because it is a greenhouse gas, okay? But it's not as important as carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, simply because it is oxidized very easily, all right? Now, what we mean by that is that when it's released into the atmosphere, it only stays in the atmosphere as CH4 for about 12 years because it reacts with oxygen. Okay, so it reacts with oxygen and hydroxide ions and turns into something else. Okay, and so it doesn't really stay in our atmosphere very long. So this explains why atmospheric concentrations generally aren't very high at all, despite the huge amount of methane that is being produced across the Earth, okay? There are areas where there is huge amounts of this stuff being produced, particularly in farms and, of course, in these anaerobic areas where there's lots of swamps, mangroves, etc. Okay, the last thing we're going to look at now is peat formation. Now, peat isn't just a name, all right? It's also a substance, okay? What it basically is, it's a substance that forms when organic matter, so carbon-containing matter, so it can be leaves, dead or animal matter, when it doesn't fully decompose because of anaerobic conditions, okay? And generally where that happens is when an animal dies or we get lots of leaves dropping off trees, and then suddenly that area fills up with water and the area turns anaerobic. So there's no oxygen available in that kind of area to help decompose the organic material. And so the saprotrophs, the fungus that live there, haven't got the oxygen available to them. And so what tends to happen then is the saprotrophs can't thrive in those conditions because they haven't got the oxygen available. And so the dead organic matter is not fully decomposed, and the acid conditions tend to develop, further inhibiting the saprotrophs or the fungus from doing their jobs. And also we find that methanogens that might break down the organic matter, they're not also able to develop there because of the particular acidic conditions that form. And so you've got this sort of partially decomposed organic matter that's very, very, very carbon rich. And so we get huge quantities of carbon lying in this stuff. And it's called peat. Now, they reckon about 3% of the Earth's land surface is covered by peat, up to a depth of around 10 meters. And so that's a huge quantity of this very, very rich carbon-containing stuff. Now, that's where we're going to finish this video for now. That's video 1 of the carbon cycle. Stay tuned for video 2.